You can start, we are online.
გამარჯობა, მოგესალმებით ყველას, ვინც შემოგვიერთდა და ვინც შემოგვიერთდება მოგვიანებით. დღეს ჩვენ ვიწყებთ ჩვენს სერიას ონლაინ შეხვედრების ამ მრგვალ მაგიდასთან სახელწოდებით პოლიტიკა, მუსიკა და ოკუპაცია, რომლის ორგანიზებაც გვიკარნახა იმ სპეციფიკურმა თარიღმა, რომელიც წელს დადგა. ეს არის 100 წელი ფატალური 1921 წლიდან, როდესაც საქართველოს პირველი დემოკრატიული რესპუბლიკა პირველმა დემოკრატიულმა რესპუბლიკამ დაკარგა დამოუკიდებლობა წითელი არმიის შემოსევის შედეგად და ძალადობრივად, ვთქვათ ასე, შეუერთდა ჯერ საბჭოთა რუსეთის, შემდეგ საბჭოთა კავშირის ორბიტას. იმ 6 შეხვედრის თემატიკა, რომელსაც მომდევნო 6 პარასკევის განმავლობაში გეგმავთ, თქვენ შეგიძლიათ იოლად ნახოთ, თუ ჯერ არ გინახავთ კონსერვატორიის Facebook გვერდზე, ხოლო დღევანდელი შეხვედრის თემა იქნება საბჭოთა ოკუპაცია და ეროვნული საკომპოზიტორო სკოლების განვითარების კურსი. იმდენად რამდენადაც დღევანდელი ჩვენი შეხვედრა ინგლისურენოვანია, შედარებით უფრო ფართო შესავალ სიტყვას თქვენის ნებართვით ინგლისურად მოგახსენებთ, მაგრამ იქამდე ქართულადაც წარმოგიდგენთ დღევანდელი შეხვედრის მთავარ მონაწილეებს. ესენი არიან პროფესორი ნანა შარიქაძე, თბილისის სახელმწიფო კონსერვატორიის რექტორი, მუსიკოლოგი, პროფესორი ნაროდიცკაია, ასევე მუსიკოლოგი ნორსვესტერნის უნივერსიტეტიდან, ილინოისის შტატი, ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატები, რომელიც აზერბაიჯანულ ეროვნულ საკომპოზიტორო სკოლაზე ისაუბრებს და პროფესორი რუტა სტანევიჩიუტა, რომელიც ლიეტუვის წარმომადგენელი გახლავთ, ის ლიეტუვის მუსიკისა და თეატრის აკადემიის პროფესორია და ის რასაკვირველია მის მშობლიურ მუსიკაზე ისაუბრებს. ძალიან ეთისული მაქვს მე სიტყვით მათი გამოსვლების მოსმენის, დარწმუნებული ვარ, რომ ასე იქნება ჩვენი აუდიტორიაც და მინდა ასევე გითხრათ, რომ იმდენად რამდენადაც თემა ძალიან საინტერესოა, იმდენად რამდენადაც მათ შეიძლება ბევრი შეკითხვა ან იდეა დაბადოს, თქვენ მაყურებლებო დამსწრენო, შეგიძლიათ რასაკვირველია ჩაერთოთ ამ შეხვედრაში, 3 სხვადასხვა გზით, ეს იქნება Zoom-ში ხელისაწვდომა, მაგალითად ჩვენ მოგცემთ სიტყვას, თქვენ ასევე შეგიძლიათ დაპოსტოთ თქვენი შეკითხვა Zoom-ის სასაუბრო ველში და ჩვენ მათ წავიკითხავთ, ხოლო თუ Facebook-ის live-ში გვადევნებთ თვალყურს, უბრალოდ დატოვეთ კომენტარი და შევეცდები, რომ არც ერთი ეს შეკითხვა პასუხის გარეშე არ დარჩეს. ახლა კი თქვენის ნებართვით მცირე შესავალ სიტყვას ინგლისურადაც მოგახსენებთ და შემდეგ უკვე სიტყვას ჩვენს სპიკერებს გადავცემ. So, good evening and welcome everyone who's tuned or will be tuned in online. And today we are launching the series of online roundtable meetings named Politics, Music and Occupation, which was prompted by the very specific date at centennial from 1921, a fatal year when the First Democratic Republic of Georgia lost its independence and violently joined the orbit of Soviet Russia and then Soviet Union. You may have already seen the poster with the topics to be discussed on the next 5 Fridays, and if you haven't, you just can easily find it on the Conservator's Facebook page. But the topic of today's meeting is the Soviet occupation and the course of national art music. And before I introduce our speakers, let me make a very short preamble. The Soviet occupation, among the other things, left its mark on the newly born national art music of Georgia. The famous sentence, the famous maxima, national inform, socialist in content, which became the official cultural ideology and requirement in all Soviet republics, determined, at least on the official level, the direction of further development of Georgian art music as well. If we could we imagine what Georgian art music could sound like if it were not the Soviet occupation? I don't really know. But I believe that 100 years is more than enough time to look and assess processes from a distance, to look and assess them critically, objectively, calmly, and without prejudice. And above all, to observe them not separately on a local level, but in the context of the national art music of other countries that shared the same fate as us, who were also members of Soviet Union. And for this purpose, I have an honor to introduce three distinguished musicologists who will discuss the course of national music from three different countries. They are Professor Nana Sharikhadze, rector of the Tbilisi State Conservatoire, who will be speaking about Georgian music. The presentation by Professor Narodickaya from Northwestern University, Illinois, USA, will allow us to learn more about Azerbaijani national art music. And Professor Ruta Stanevičiūtė from the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre will talk about music from her native country. I really look forward to listening to all these three speeches and their discussions as well. And I'm also sure that so are you. So I'm also sure that the audience will have many questions, ideas. So at the end of our meeting, please feel free to join in the discussion. You can raise your hand at Zoom and we will give you the word. You can also post your question in the Zoom chat area and I will read it out for you. Or if you're following our meeting on Facebook, please leave your comment and I will do my best. That's all for me. And now I ask the first speaker, Professor Nana Sharikhadze, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to greet my colleagues from Vilnius, from Chicago, and express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to be part of the first meeting around the table. The issue about the Georgian Compositional School during the occupation has risen since the Soviet Union has collapsed. And this issue has become a topical one for the different generation of the musicologists, Georgian musicologists. Actually, the Compositional School was established in the beginning of the last century and has reflected the turbulence of Georgia's entire history from first independence to the Russian annexation of 1921 to 1992, when independence was regained. It's not possible, of course, to cover the full history of music development in Georgia. However, the main turning points will be highlighted from the perspective of Georgian history. And in this story, it's not only important to describe the effects from Stalin's regime or the Tsar period, but also it's important and crucial to explain how music was developing under Soviet and post-Soviet rule as well. But it's, for me personally, it's also essential to keep everything in a very communicative way, just not to be very precise and very specific, but also to tell the story about the Georgian music under the Soviet rule. So the Georgian Professional Compositional School was established in the beginning of 20th century by the time of occupation, 1921. And the significant works, including establishment of National Classical Opera, or by Paliashvili, Arakhishvili, Viktor Dolidze, or other works by Nikol Sukhanishvili were written before occupation during the country's short independence time. It's also worth mentioning that the establishment of the Georgian Compositional School in 1921 was a logical result of the long process started in the 19th century, epoch which happened to be one of the turning points for the further progress of Georgian professional music, with the emphasis on the main trends and developments of the European culture. Movement of the education Georgian youth, mainly educated in Russia under the leadership of Ilya Chavchavadze, to protect Georgian language and culture from Russianization. If we recall a little history on how the professional school was founded, we could see that starting from the 19th century, there is a vibrant musical life in Georgia, mainly represented by the European and Russian professional music representatives. Musicians from all over the world were carrying out intense musical and concert activities, among them students of Benyavsky, Marmontel, Tchaikovsky, Moscheles, Kulau, as well as Levine, Ippolito Vivanov, Kessner, Truskovsky, Vronsky, Brogy, and others. Also Rubinstein, Arakhishvili, and Paliashvili, the Georgian composers, former alumni of the Moscow and St. Petersburg conservatoires, and founders of the new Georgian Compositional School, and many others. Conjunction of the national musical language with the European professional music appeared to be a catalyst for the establishment of the Georgian Professional Compositional School before occupation. The 1921 forced Georgia to become part of the world where the limited connections with the West, followed by the full suppression in the 30s. Soviet ideological fathers imposed a ban on information as well to illustrate the real situation in music under the Soviet rule. I would refer to Akaki Bakradze, Georgian publicist and writer, who described the state in the literature as follows, but we can just spread it also on music. Quoting, any doctrine was expression of Russia's interest, which considered interest of Georgia only to the extent of being acceptable for Russia. What is good and admissible for Russia is good and admissible for Georgia and for all non-Russians. We have become one of the Russia's provinces like Tambov or Kaluga region. Approximately 25 years before, the well-known Polish composer Zygmunt Michalski was also describing the same situation in Poland. The role and function of official art music was to create a status or position after occupation and the privilege and esteem attached to it. So what did art music look like in terms of gaining status, fitting the ideology, having the proper aesthetical background and becoming part of the cultural space as permitted by the cultural center? That's a very important question that should be also answered. What did those unmortified art music composers have to contradict? Briefly going through all the above mentioned questions and outlining art music according to a black and white reality, the following might be said: that the status that our compositional school occurred after the occupation was official, and it was contradicted to the unofficial one, unofficial ideology. Soviet contradicting to anti-Soviet. Aesthetical basis was social realism, that was contradicting to the modernism and avant-gardism. Cultural space was narrowed to the borders of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, including Georgia, and that was contradicting to the Western political bloc. And cultural center was, of course, Moscow. That was also contradicted to the multi-center cultural approach of the West. This black and white reality was introduced with the intention to preserve the party line in culture, and that literally meant using censorship as a tool for ensuring the normal official order in art to strengthen the Soviet ideology through cultural means. Capital of the USSR introduced the rules for the art and obliged all artists through the centralized system, ministries of culture, as well as union of composers in each republic, units for culture in the central committee, to follow them. And moreover, those rules didn't contribute to the independent development of the creative processes in music, especially for those compositional schools that were pretty young and that had not had any history like in 19th or 18th or 17th century, because Georgia had very strong old professional music that was originated from the church, but the new professional music after occupation found itself in absolutely new reality that was Soviet realism. If we just jump through the history and jump to the Tsar periods, then Tsar politics softened the situation just partly, but it does not mean that they softened and lifted up the cultural policy that Soviet Union and ideological fathers were adherent to. The reality in the world music differed from the one we had during 1921 and 1953, and also after that. If we have a quick overview of the Western musical processes with its devotion for experiments in the musical language, compositional techniques, style, it's impossible to find anything like social realism in any of the compositional schools in the West, but that was plenty enough here under the Soviet rule. Occupation of the 1921 introduced new reality with its new working class aesthetical rules, and thus the natural process, I emphasize the natural process of the further development of the professional compositional school was stopped. No one is able to say what the development of the musical processes would have been looking like if the history of Georgia would have developed in another way, but Today, it's evident that right after the establishment of the new professional compositional school in the beginning of 20th century, instead of accumulating and developing ideas already introduced by the first generation of the Georgian composers, the new mechanisms and rules on how the music should have been written were imposed on. And in this process, it was very important to keep in line with the propaganda and keep in line with the party decisions, because the party decision was important one than the aesthetical and creative ideas and free ideas, let's say. And maybe that's why even the composers from the first generation, they occurred in a situation when they just tried to adapt their, let's say, musical behavior to the new requirements. And we could say that only after Stalin's death and only after the declaration of Tao principles, the Georgian composers of 60s and 80s, they really grasped a fresh air from different sources, from the music that was banned, from the composers that were coming from the West to the Soviet Union, from visits outside of the Soviet Union, and mainly the destination was the important Festival of the Modern Music, Warsaw Autumn. So all these things, they strengthened the Georgian composers' aesthetical background, let's say, and they found innerly strength to develop the Georgian music in a very diverse form, starting from official and ending with unofficial music in the end of the 20th century. That was actually shortly what I wanted to talk about, and now I will give floor to my colleagues as well. And afterwards, I will also wait for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Professor Ina Nararodskaya, I really am very interested to listen to your speech, because we, Professor Sheikh presented the music in Georgia, you're presenting music of Azerbaijan, and those two countries, they're so close neighbors, and they have so many common and different things between each other. So it really, I'm really looking forward to listen to you. Just turn on your microphone.
I'm going to switch for the slides, and I will try to make it. First of all, thank you, Professor Nana Sharikhadze. It was very interesting, slightly different than mine, but I'm going to go to slides and there will be my guides. Oops. Okay, so this is the books that I wrote. In the middle, Song from the Land of Fire, and this is the volume on Azerbaijani music and politics. I want to bring your attention to Bewitching Russian Opera, because it deals with empire and politics. And with that, I move to three questions rather quickly. I'm very happy to let you know that November 5th of this year, there is going to be performance dedicated of Hajibeyev's composition, because he's a central figure in my talk, but he also is a barometer of the changes that happened in the course of the 20th century that I'm going to address. Three topics that I'm covering in relation to our questions will be: one, dealing with ethnic neighborhood in the Caucasus or Trans-Caucasus that was in transition from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union. The second question would be art, musical, or opera, and I'm happy that we coincide with this. And the third is going to be the issue of women, which is, of course, always interesting in relation to the Islamic culture. So Hajibeyev is 1885 to 1948. Okay, and I'm moving into next slide. So this is the Transcaucasus the way we know now, but I'm going to talk just for a second and I will depart from Hajibiev. Hajibiev was born in, he was growing in Karabakh, okay, which is this contested area now between Azerbaijan and Armenia. He grew up in a family of Natavan, Princess Natavan, who was a rather cosmopolitan figure and a very modern woman. She was a daughter of the last Khan of Karabakh. He studied in Gori, okay, and then he moved to Baku to produce his first opera. And then he moved to wherever I cannot see, in St. Petersburg for a year to acquire some traditional Russian or Western European training. Okay, so this is how map looked into the pre-revolutionary, rather 1890. This is a map of 1890. What is interesting here, and this is very different from Soviet period, is that if you look closely, there is different nationalities here. Multiple, many groups. Azerbaijan is not here, it says Turks, different types of Turks, okay? Ossetian, Kurds, and various others. This is just to show to you the pastiche, okay? And this pastiche was reflected in music. And I'm gonna show to you several groups, just the photographs of several groups at the break of the century. Their names of the groups became written into the history of Azerbaijani oral tradition of Mogam, but there are multiple multinational groups. So this is Kemanchist, Bahagul Aga Oghli. This is famous Sadegjan who brought tar, this is musical instrument leading in the Caucasus, to the chest. That was this tradition. But if you look at this figure, this is Vaso Kikelishvili, okay? And that's typical of many different groups. Here, if you read in Russian, you can see this is famous Said Shushinsky, who established the school of the Mugham training, and his grandson now is a leading jazz musician in Azerbaijan. Okay, so in my book, I talk about dynasties, but if you read the other names, there is Nagaris Anton, possibly Armenian, and then Oghli Grigor, Antar, Kemanchist Sevi. So it's again multinational group. This is another very famous group, okay, with Sasha Aganezashvili, who plays the Kemancha, okay? So it's interesting because even in pre-revolutionary years, the Azerbaijani oral cultures or Mugham get exposed in the West. This is in Poland, recording of the Jabar Karyagdi, famous Azerbaijani musician. So I'm going to show to you a couple of recordings now from Baku and explain that sudden interest to Azerbaijani culture, and at the time we don't call it Azerbaijani, we talk Turks or Mohammedans, comes from, of course, oil, discovery of oil. And oil brings multinational cosmopolitan group to Baku. I write it in my book. So profitable was the in the industry of neft that noble brothers made their capitals in Baku at the time. And of course, bringing multinational groups of entrepreneurs in Azerbaijan led to establishment, first of all, of local aristocracy or business tycoons, and second, culture that was not known before the last decade in Baku, which is an ancient town, city with unpaved streets, suddenly turned into bustling capital. So in the last decade, to be specific, I think in 1883, one of the earliest Azerbaijani magnate or the tycoon and benefactor builds the theater. And here it's a concert of 1902, in which again, you can see that there are great Azerbaijani performers, but also Avanes and various others. So it's a truly, and here we also combine two local traditions, Mugham, which comes from, as I assert, from the Arabic Persian roots, and ashiks, who comes, the tradition that comes from the Central Asian Turkic stream. 1908 marked by the premiere of the Leyli Mejnun. This happens in a theater of Tahrir, which I will show to you a little bit later. Okay, so 1908, 1909, this is the earliest poster that I could find. If you will find Leyli and Mejnun, performer of Leyli, this is Farajev, okay? So it's a male performer role. He had to shave his mustache, which he refused to do, and was covered with the whatever fat there could be, because this was not mainly. And I will try to go quickly through this. This is another poster of this. And what I would like to pay your attention to, this is produced in Tiflis in 1914, okay, in Georgian theater, first Musulmanskaya opera, okay. Interesting that poster is coming in 2 languages. I'm going to show to you the theater now. And there is one, so this is Tahrir Theater, which was built in 1983. One thing that here I want to point out is the men prevailing on the scene. You will not find women here. This is wonderful buffet in the theater. And again, you will not find women there. In 1906, there is the call in the newspaper that in the revamping, reconstructing the theater, in Tahrir Theater, there will be created balconies with the heavy curtains in which the women would be able, through the gaps, to look into production on the scene, okay? And that was done. The first performer who enters the stage is Shafkat Mamedova, whom I remember as a very old woman teaching vocal classes in Azerbaijani conservatory, okay? She was the first woman who is an age of 15, appeared on a stage dressed in a Western dress and unveiled. She was attacked by fanatics, and Hajibiev himself, redressing her in a boy clothes, took her to the train, and she departed first to Tiflis and then to St. Petersburg, okay? So in that respect, revolution speeded up significantly process with women. In one of the earliest decades, in 1990, there is the additional pay for students and for teachers in Muslim women music schools, okay? So that was actually decreed. And soon in 26, we can see the first graduates of the school of conservatoire. This is Hajibiev, and this is Shafkat Mamedova, who appeared a few years earlier and had to escape from Baku. Okay, and you can see other women, multinational group also. Okay, this is the group of the choir that Hajibiev created. And now I'm going to depart from this, and I just want to react on a few things. So coming to the questions, I think changes in Azerbaijani culture began not with the Soviet Revolution, but with early 19th century, where Russian Empire acquired this land after long negotiation and manipulation with the 2 main players in the area, Turkey and Iran. Okay, and it is discovery of oil that speeded up process significantly. After revolution, the revolution, unlike in Georgia, led to first of all differentiation of the 3 republics, and rather than free collaboration with whatever regional conflict there could be, free collaboration between musicians, it became institutionalized communication of 3 groups. Okay, so minority cultures was overshadowed. For example, in Azerbaijan before the revolution, there were 3 schools of Mugham. It was Shirvan, Karabakh, and Baku. After revolution, soon, people from Karabakh moved to Baku, and the center, the capital, became the breeding land for no longer Dagestan, Lezgi, but for Azerbaijani manifestation, okay? So, and of course, creation of the opera was taking place before Soviet Revolution, but Soviet Revolution brought the system of education, which was Western. And I want to comment on something that Nana said, that we all grew up in a philosophy of social realism. National in form, socialist in content. And I'm very pleased and happy that you said that it was also applied to the West, on which we drew, but it was West in a form, but socialist in content, which was, of course, presents the conflict. And I know that I'm probably taking too much time, but I want to end with, it's interesting that when Hajibiev created his opera, it was partially composed and partially improvised. So he composed orchestral parts, intermissions, and choruses. But the solo numbers of Leyli and Mejnun were improvised in traditional style of Mugham with the tar and kemancha small national ensemble on the stage. Okay, so in the course of the 20th century, the hybrid music became extraordinarily interesting in Azerbaijan, and many composers growing in Hajibiev school did it no longer by necessity, because when he did it, no Azerbaijani could read music, and no Russian or any other orchestral musicians could improvise. But in the course of the 20th century, there was a combination, hybridization of the oral and composed tradition. In the middle of century and by the end of the century, even though hybrid exists, it became more as a fancy tip on a cake, okay? Tradition that identified. By the early 21st century, after the separation from Soviet Union and so forth, suddenly what was composed before began to be played orally, no longer with music. So the full span from Hajibiev, Leyli, and Mejnun, which comes from Shiite Muslim tradition, okay? This plot line is used, and he first listened to this in the house of Notavan during Maharam. Whoever is noticing it, fine. If not, I will answer the questions. So first improvised, then hybrid opera, then traditional opera and other many art music that were created and fully composed. And now it gets back to the oral improvisation. And if I have some time, I can show to you the fragment of the Morris Ballet, which is staged with Alim Gassimov and Silk Road Project, where the traditional musicians, Alim Gassimov and his daughter, improvised on a theme of Hajibiev with the dance attached. Now Western dance, new dance, political shift elsewhere. That's what I wanted to say. I hope I didn't confuse everybody who listens to this, but if you want, I show the fragments of dance.
A short fragment, please. I guess it will be really interesting.
Frankly, I prepared the other, but just a second. Oops.
Or if there is any link on YouTube or something, we can just post it in our comment section.
I'm about just now placing it. Just a second. I'm lost here. Okay. Oops. Okay, so this is the example that I wanted to show, because the full round from oral to hybrid to composed, now to oral back through Hajibiev. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your really very interesting speech and presentation. And before, I guess we all have lots of questions, but before we ask it, Professor Ruta Stanevic, please, we are waiting to your speech.
Thank you very much, first of all, for invitation to join this discussion. I will speak also about some kind of hybridization, but from a slightly another perspective. And we'll start from mid-20th century political events, which divided Lithuanian music culture into two parts, one in homeland and the other beyond its borders. In the 1940s, two Soviet occupations of Lithuania and the Second World War led to a politically motivated emigration among the Lithuanian music elite. In post-war period, many prominent figures in musical life before the war, modernist composers, outstanding representatives of the opera, conductors and performers, spent several years in displaced person camps in Germany and other European countries. And later, the majority of these musicians settled mainly in the United States. This division of Lithuanian music culture had a significant impact on the distribution of composers and music performers between the two continents. For example, the emigration included younger generation of modernist composers educated at the Western new music centers such as Paris, Berlin, or Prague. And I have to say that this younger generation, which included Vytautas Bacevičius, brother of Polish composer Grażyna Bacevich, Jeronimas Kačinskas, Vladas Jakubėnas, and others, already during interwar years, they founded a Society of Progressive Musicians, and later they established the Lithuanian section of the International Society of Contemporary Music. It was the first national section for Baltic countries in this organization. So the large contingent of modernist composers that had formed in emigration stood in contrast to those who had remained in Soviet Lithuania. There, even composers who had studied at European music centers before the war were forced to make drastic changes to their composition, compelled to master the Russian music models, which were based on the socialist realist doctrine. In this respect, the composer's situation in the newly occupied region was different slightly from that in other national republics, because especially that these composers, again, were educated in Warsaw, Leipzig, or other schools, but not in Russia mainly. The new controlled Soviet Lithuanian music so evolved as an eclectic mutant, some hybridic also formed by the interbreeding of a national style that had just begun to develop in the interwar period and the great Soviet Stalinist style. Only post-war Lithuanian composition offered a flexible synthesis of Russian classics, a new style of Soviet music, an imaginary Soviet Lithuanian identity, which, as an expression of Soviet-type folk character, became obligatory for any national minority composer, and also included some remnants of the interwar national style. So it was real hybrid mixture of stylistic orientations. Also, the second Soviet occupation resulted in an unexpected leap of several secondary composers into the first ranks. Some of them even was awarded the Stalin Prize. Somebody who never been treated as serious composer before the war. So this way we could speak about a radical change of both musical and cultural identities, as well as music elite during the early period of Sovietization of the Lithuanian music culture. Later on, the significant shifts in Lithuanian music took place at turn of the late 1950s and 1960s, and by mid-1970s. Although it is not possible to speak about absolute synchronization of a political and cultural histories, these historical periods correspond in some way with the beginning of a political liberation, so-called Khrushchev ottepel, in the Soviet Union, and accordingly by the beginning of a Soviet political stagnation. And it seems to me that in other republics we have also the same periods as important landmark. Because I was asked to speak not only with what was lost, but also what was gained. So I have to say that it would be a major simplification to assess the Sovietization of the Lithuanian music culture as the absolute evil. In this context, three main achievements can be distinguished when reassessing the Sovietization of Lithuanian music culture. First, development of standardized music education system and easy access to music education. Secondly, art music institution building and development at regional level. I think this regionalization and spread of professional, especially concert halls, was really some achievement of Soviet times. And third, it's intercultural and transnational exchange and networking at both formal and informal level. The general restructuring of Soviet music culture, in Soviet Lithuania, served first of all, in my opinion, for music performance. Since the situation of a performance differed significantly from the other group of musicians, especially composers. The music performers were a privileged group of Soviet artistic elite, not only musical, I think all the Soviet artistic elite, not only because of a more or less abstract nature of their artistic expression, but also due to some political and economical reasons. Soviet music as so-called soft power was used in the Cold War ideological confrontation and political diplomacy. And at the same time, it was an important part of Soviet export and Soviet musical economy. It would be, a long discussion, but because I also conducted some research in Moscow in the papers of Goskoncert, I was just shocked by numbers of incomes in this organization. So foreign cultural policy of the USSR favored the art of classical performance as a means of consolidating the achievements and prestige of Soviet culture. Even the scope of foreign concert tours and musical exchanges arranged through official channels revealed that rather exclusive status of art music in the Soviet Union. Political and economical leverage became strongly intertwined there. And in the late Soviet period, the economic factor, at least in the case of music as a performance art, began to predominate. Lithuanian music performance art was part of export of music through the official channels of the Soviet Union. And even in Soviet times, Lithuanian performers had also the opportunity to study abroad at some prestigious institutions such as La Scala or Paris Conservatory. In opposition, the Lithuanian composers faced much more restrictions concerning education and international spread of their creation. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, none of Lithuanian composers had the opportunity to enter officially the studies in Western institutions of higher music education. This gap was fulfilled by imaginary identification with Western new music centers, trends, and personalities, especially since late 1950s, the period of political liberation. The strongest attraction centers abroad for Lithuanian composers were metropolises of avant-garde and modernism, as well as strong Lithuanian emigre communities, Germany, France, the USA, And moreover, Poland as the closest neighbor, especially the way structure of festivals and influence of Warsaw Autumn. Especially during the late Soviet period, when the official discourse was ignored at national level, local initiatives and informal ties became more important than exchanges and collaboration through the official channels. Like in other republics of Soviet Union, the cultural atmosphere was replaced by informal international relations and the networks of musicians that formed on their basis. However, it was specifically in the late Soviet era that significant turning points in the artistic identification of Lithuanian composers took place. I mean about this mid of 1970s. The outside-oriented discourse of music was replaced by discourse of familiarity. So instead of some identification with some centers, Western centers outside, there's something inside, and another type of relations became and experiences became very important. And such a modus operandi correlated with the intense atmosphere of personal artistic communication, characteristic of the independent cultural milieux of the USSR during the late Soviet period. Interesting that not only some researchers in the Soviet history or anthropologists as Alexei Yurchak also mentioned this importance of this intense personal atmosphere and relations in the late Soviet period, but also Polish musicologists were mentioned and highlighted the same tendency during the late Cold War period. So I have to say that at the end of Cold War, the identity of Lithuanian music as being in opposition to the Soviet cultural discourse, this official discourse, had already been formed and legitimated, and it allowed to close and distant cultural milieux to recognize and define Lithuanian music as other and simultaneously as integral part of a European tradition. And what I would like also to mention that this informal networking, especially in the Soviet Union, I think we need to pay more attention about this topic. And I would like just to remember some really important some phenomena in this case. For example, Baltic Musicological Conferences, which was established as official event in 1967, and later it transformed to the important international open forum, alternative to the official Soviet musicological doctrine, and many new ideas, historiographical ideas was discussed. Another example might be some informal exchanges, contacts and networkings between Yuri Holopov School from Moscow Conservatory and Music Theory School at Vilnius Conservatory of that time, which was really very productive exchange, and many, by the way, doctoral dissertations was defended in Vilnius, which was, slightly topics was probably not comfortable in Moscow. One more example might be the very also informal exchange and collaboration between Vilnius and Kiev composers, which might be slightly, unexpected to this exchange, but I think also it had some very interesting results. Not speaking about Lithuanian-Polish collaboration from mid-70s, which resulted in numerous independent festivals, musicological conferences, and series of commissioned compositions. So to conclude my short presentation about what was lost and what was gained during the Soviet time and about some period of changes, I would like to say just that probably my position would be that we should perhaps avoid excessive politicization of Soviet music history and its late period in particular. And I would like to stress that I think we definitely need more comparative history of so-called Soviet music cultures, because instead of this Soviet official internalization, we never had a real comparative history of Soviet music. And in this context, I prefer to speak about Soviet Union as empire and to think about this mixed hybrid identities, colonial, post-colonial, already during the Soviet imperial period. And also what is important to me also in the context of our today discussion, that I see many examples of continuation of Russian Empire identities, musical practices, and Soviet. So if we will start to think about this geographical area in between two empires, I think we will have some very interesting considerations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your super interesting presentation, which I'm sure arose loads of questions. Maybe the speakers have some before I ask mine.
May I, Maya?
Sure.
First of all, it was very interesting to listen to both of you because you raised all of those very important topics that are very relevant for this time and for this period of our music history. And we have so many things in common that I was listening now to Ruta and also to Inna and all these complementary things and multi-layered approaches, also the attempt to find the way out, even in this very strict under the strict ideological pressure, was absolutely the same approach also in Georgia. I would like to ask Ruta, when you are talking about this informal context, because I agree that they were very important. Also, this informal context between composers, not only officially, but between composers, between different schools. To what extent this informal contacts brought certain composers of Lithuanian music to the radical changes, to the changes that were beyond of official status, that were under unofficial status, and when it started in your music history?
I think that, you know, in our music history, it started probably with studies of Osvaldas Balakauskas at Kiev.
Yeah.
So because he didn't enter the Lithuanian conservatory, and in 1960s, he moved to Kiev, and how it started. And by the way, when you just remember, I also did some research at Silvestrov papers at Paul Zacher Foundation, and I found some even correspondence between Silvestrov and others where they just mention that we are this group informal in Soviet Union, just with names. Mm-hmm. You know, in different republics. So it is very interesting that it was very conscious attitude and a very conscious position. So I think that this really did a lot with just accidentally, I think it was just accidentally Balakauskas did this choice to study at Kiev. And because of Blushkov, Silvestrov, and others, yes, Rao Grabowski and others, Kiev, a group of avant-garde musicians and composers. He also became involved in this. But also it was advertised when he returned in the 70s to Lithuania, but I think by the mid of 70s already this informal ties became stronger and stronger. And I remember even Tatiana Cherednichenko in her book of Neprikosnovenny Zapas, yes, she wrote about that this real change in Soviet Union was mid of the 70s. Mm-hmm. This beginning of stagnation, that it was this, when people started just to neglect this official discourse, yes, because the emancipation of individual and the official discourse became extremely far from each other. So so I think it was just very parallel process in all the Soviet republics, and at the same time this collaboration with Polish musicians started. It was mid of the 70s, and when you ask how it influenced, first of all, it was commissions, especially commissioned by Polish institution and also private Krzysztof Penderecki commission. So it was really important in Soviet Union, to receive this foreign commission to compose. For Lithuanian composers, they were much more, was not so known, I think, and internationally. So I think this was a big influence for composers, just to be performed by international musicians and to receive this commission. So
I will have to leave you very soon, but I would love to raise several questions that kind of looming on me. One of them is, Ruta, I would like you to discuss asynchronic. Actually, for all of us, I like the concept of asynchronic relation between music and politics, and I deal with this a lot in. Once I wrote about Bayat Shiraz that was created by Mirov, and the end of this, then unresolved dominant function that is sustained, okay, in 60s, in the late 60s. And I claim that in early 2000, okay, Vasif Adudezal resolved the chord, okay? So, but it's very interesting to talk about asynchronic. I would love, Nana, for you to comment on use of native lore, because this is a topic very close to me. How not only using native lore, but also creating native lore. Because you dealt with early Georgian operas and Paliashvili. I mean, all of them are in. This is not just a good taste. That's not Mozartian tale. Okay, this is the solid creating of this, what is national, but it was more than socialistic. So anyway, I also would like to propose that Maya should compile the volume on comparative study of certain period or certain genre, because, for example, today we talked about operas a lot. I'm sure Ruta can take this further, but maybe create the comparative national opera, or maybe comparative something, okay? Maybe even by period. And the last but not the least, I wanted for all of us, but maybe not me, to talk. We did not touch upon popular music. But of course, this is the domain that always went from against the official policies. And that was the area in which people experimented the most, and most obviously alluring the youth. For example, I don't know, Ruta, much about your jazz development in Lithuania, but I certainly know about Georgia and Azerbaijan. For example, jazz or estrada, how did it become? Okay, so that's 4 points that I wanted to make as a possible discussion or possible continuation.
If possible, I would like just to support Ina's idea about this comparative history. By the way, even me studied some Azerbaijani music, including Adigezalov and Karakarayev, because I tried to follow the African topic in Soviet music. So, and I have a question for you, because what you presented, I think, is also comparable with other, with our nations, when you presented this multicultural, multi-ethnic this situation, and how it was later, when, for example, or it was the period in Azerbaijani music when it became more important to have, this clear something like just Azerbaijani identity, more like.
I think it kind of, we all talked about this, that it is and it isn't, right?
Okay.
It is and it isn't ever. So the moment you begin to feel comfortable to establishing Azerbaijani, then you depart from this, because this is Azerbaijani Soviet. So to what extent art music could represent Azerbaijan? It was a marketable domain. I mean, we can present it as equal or more than German, okay? But I think it's in a search. I think this whole myth of nation is always in a search, in a process of discovery. So now, as I said, as I showed the last fragment with the same Lili and Majnun, now it's the same myth, but turned to the West, to America, because I actually watched this ballet in Chicago under the Silk Road Project. So that's it. And I think it's a musical thing, always negotiation between commissions and realization.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a good question.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions?
I can't agree more on Ruta's and Ina's ideas, about what was said, but also there was very important topic reasoned by both of them. What was happening not only during the empire, but between two empires. Because maybe, and thank you for raising this topic, Ruta, really, because I think that that's also part of not only politics as a concrete politics of a certain country, but also broaden understanding of the politics also in culture and music. And that's also part of our identity, because the question that Ina asked me about the national style, yes, of course, in the beginning, when we were trying to introduce national opera, of course, we were thinking before occupation, and it's not connected with the politics. We were thinking how to realize our identity as other European schools through language. And of course, the national source was very important. And what we got before occupation as a threshold of the political thing in the very important stage of the life from our country's history is that we got the first professional compositional school in the beginning of 20th century. We got the aesthetics on how we are going to introduce ourselves in certain musical genres. But when Ruta raised this question, what happened between these two empires, actually, this is something that it's worth it to think about, because very interesting topics will appear also, even if we are talking that we were thrown into the absolutely free world without rules. But when we are talking about without rules, it means that we are talking about without Soviet rules, especially in the 90s. It's very interesting what decision was made by the creative minds of our composers and how they were seeing themselves within these things. And I think that comparativeness will be very important also in this case. And I just doubt that we are pushing some project maybe to make together joint project where these topics will be discussed from different point of views, because we have common past, we have a certain period where the turbulence was common for all of our former Soviet republics, and maybe we will be able to also find some ways how we reflect it after these political turbulences between two empires, because actually we are now living in that times.
And if possible, I would like also to respond to Nana's paper and to support this idea that we have also to return back from our national perspectives to this early period of Soviet occupation.
Yes.
And even this idea about two empires, I think it is useful to think what was happening during Stalinism time.
Absolutely.
I think that we will probably would have another perspective, neither Russian scholars who now write about Stalinism and Stalin awards and others, because for me that the treat, it was the same like in Russian Empire. It was just repetition of Russian, with imperialism and Russian colonialism, how it was with national music treated. So I think it would be also very interesting just to, with not like in the early 90s, in the with early independence, talk about totalitarianism. Now we have a little bit another distance to reassess everything.
Absolutely, and I agree that controlling language is the direct path to controlling minds. And music is a powerful language, and that's why the ideological fathers, not only from the Soviets, but also in in different historical times, they were trying to control language, and that was very important for them. And that's absolutely topical to reassess the Stalinist times also in that regard.
I would propose, it's also interesting that our view changing, of course. So I'm just kind of like thinking of this, that if we would create the compilation of comparative study of early 20th century, pre or in traditional period, from the view of 100 years later, because of course, at the early 20th century, following the imperial model or following the West was a positive move. For how long I don't know about you, I grew up thinking about modernization, Westernization. It's very quick. So to create this arch, the view of early 20th century from in the early 21st century, so 100 years back.
Yeah, that's very, very exciting idea. Very exciting idea. And also in that regard, what the education was doing and contributing to those processes, because music education is also part of this very global problem during Stalinism and in Zhao times, and also between two empires, and in the beginning during Russian Tsarism, let's say. That's also very, very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I guess our time is expiring, and I really guess that this 1 hour and some more minutes were not enough at all for the ideas you have aroused here. And thank you all for so many interesting stories and even more ideas, which I really wish wholeheartedly to be realized, and why not? And thank you for that, because I guess our meeting today had more than fulfilled this mission. We started to talk, we started to share experience, share stories, and plan some more further activities. So again, thank you very much, and I wish to continue such kind of activities, or more in maybe more large-scale project in future.
More informal collaboration.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that we will get back to further cooperation and maybe even to the project, because that's really something that will be innovative as well.
Yes. Thank you, Mayachka, Nana, Ruta.
Thank you very much.
It was great to meet two of you and reconnect with Maya. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all three of you for your precious time, and hope to meet you physically somewhere very soon.
Bye-bye.